you've met President Putin, but do you think that he is now going to be somewhat aghast that his plan for Ukraine doesn't seem to be going quite as he'd hoped?
Well, I hope he's aghast because I think he really has miscalculated. We first came across Putin as a new president of Russia when he signed up to a NATO-Russia summit document in 2002 with Tony Blair, a young leader, fresh-faced, seemingly basking in the attention of all the different NATO leaders then. And then he wanted to work with the West, that seemed clear. David Cameron went to see him in 2010, when he was then Prime Minister for a few years. He was by then already a colder, harder, more autocratic man. And I think you're right that in recent years he's been very isolated. He's been obsessing about a sense of humiliation of Russia in those post-Cold War days, and has now got an absolute fixation on reducing Ukraine to a vassal status, a kind of buffer zone between Russia and what he sees as the adversary in NATO. But I don't think he's getting good advice. I don't think anyone dares give him honest advice, either about the extent to which the Ukrainians would fight or the impact on Russian public opinion. And so I think he may now be finding out that he's made a massive miscalculation here. I think he has to see it through to the bitter end, otherwise it really would be the end of him. But it's going to be much, much more costly in many ways than he ever anticipated, I think.
The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss on this programme earlier said she thought that it could be the end of Putin. We heard a former Georgian minister telling us that whereas those military operations in Georgia and indeed to seize Crimea back in 2014 had boosted Putin's popularity, this time it's not working. It's having the reverse effect. We're even seeing members of the Duma openly criticising President Putin.
And he made no effort to prepare Russian public opinion for this. As you say, there was a sort of nationalist buzz over the occupation of Crimea, which people saw as a core part of historic Russia. This time there's been no preparation, and there is no popular support, clearly. There is no wish to see Russia fighting a fellow Slav nation killing fellow Slav citizens. And so it is curious that he's launched this massive high-risk gamble without having prepared his public or political opinion. And to see political demonstrations against it in Russia is remarkable. People are taking huge risks in doing that.
President Putin has come up with various excuses. He talked about defending Russians from genocide in Ukraine. He's talked about denazifying the country. He's tried to dismiss the Ukrainian leadership as bandits and drug dealers. I'm just looking at a tweet from the president of Russia Twitter account that says the president congratulated Special Operations Forces personnel and veterans on their professional holiday. It all sounds a bit, frankly, bizarre.
It sounds completely bizarre, but he has now bet his entire future and reputation on achieving what he sees as a success here. And I don't see how he can stop before he has overthrown the government in Kiev, replaced it with a puppet government, and established Russian control over the main cities and centers in Ukraine. But then he's going to have to leave tens or hundreds of thousands of Russian forces there to keep a quisling government in power. Because if he didn't, it would very soon be overturned by the Ukrainian guerrilla resistance, which is going to become very much the norm. So he's in a real bind now. And I think those that saw him as a strategist who had a long-term view have been wrong. This has been a visceral, emotional reaction following years of brooding about what he saw as the humiliation of Russia. And he's now facing a very, very serious circumstances himself.
Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, was caught on camera telling Scots Guards that he thought Putin had gone full Tonto. Do you think there is something in that he's lost the plot a bit?
I don't know he's lost the plot. I suspect that he underestimated the willingness of the Ukrainians to fight, and he's now got a more serious operation on his hands. I think he wanted to avoid street-to-street fighting in Kiev. He hoped the Ukrainian government would run away like the Afghan government did. Well, that turned out to be a miscalculation. President Zelensky has come through as a real hero from all this, as have the ordinary people of Ukraine. But I think he will, if necessary, go to street fighting in order to overthrow the government. Otherwise, I think his reputation is done. But, he's not got Russian public opinion with him. There are going to be serious Russian casualties. And then he looks to me like he's going to get bogged down in an occupation of large parts of Ukraine for years to come.
Paul War is with me.
Hi, Peter. Obviously it's difficult to do any COD psychoanalysis of President Putin. People have tried and failed. But to what extent do you think it's ironic that this man whose own older brother died in the siege of Leningrad in the Second World War is now besieging a major capital like Kyiv? And do you think there's any way in which anyone around him might actually point that out?
No, absolutely not. I think he's turned himself to an old-fashioned autocrat, a kind of czar, that extraordinary National Security Council we saw on the television, and then the ranting speeches that he's given on Russian TV shows that he sees himself as in absolute control now. And so, no, I don't think anyone dares do that. I think he is in legacy mode, and I think he sees his legacy as leaving Russia surrounded by weak states, protected from a hostile outside world, and in a way recreating a greater Russia. I mean, that seems to all of us a completely deluded ambition, but that I think is his vision. And because nobody is prepared to stand up to him, he is taking these risks, making these big errors of judgment and miscalculation, in my view, without anyone being prepared to stand up and say, look, I'm not sure this is wise, President. I don't think you last very long if you tell the President something's not wise at the moment.
Yeah, but how concerned are you about the apparent nuclear threat that he issued right at the beginning of this invasion? I mean, there's a madman theory of nuclear deterrence, exemplified by Richard Nixon, of course, where he thought that communist regimes thought he'd be irrational and unstable enough to launch a nuclear weapon. It didn't work in Vietnam, and it might not work now, or will it?
Well, I think it's extremely irresponsible to start talking in those terms about nuclear weapons. Even at the height of the Cold War, Soviet leaders were very careful not to do that. Putin, though, has always had a habit of brandishing his nuclear capability in the face of the West. He's got to make up for the fact that he is in charge of a weak economy and a population cowed, but not necessarily in favor of him. And so it's braggadocio, I think. My own feeling is that he's had no intention of coming into a direct confrontation with NATO. I think he understands the strength of NATO, and he's been trying to divide the issue of Ukraine from the issue of NATO. So I think it's boastful, I think it's threatening, menacing, it's kind of typical KGB playbook. And of course we have to take it seriously, but the right way to respond to it is to show our absolute solidarity with other members of NATO, build up NATO forces in the east of Europe. By the way, exactly what Putin wanted to avoid, I think, at the outset of this. But I don't think we need to be too cowed by these threats about nuclear weapons.
And finally, do you think, actually, you mentioned that he will try and now see this through to the end. Do you think that there is a chance that it could be the end of him if he tries to do that, and that maybe there are some people within the regime who are actually going to suggest ways of getting rid of him? Is that a forlorn hope, and that perhaps the realistic outcome is that we've got years of war of attrition in Ukraine?
I'm rather on the second of those, Paul. I mean, I would love to think that there might be some kind of plot against Putin, to dislodge him over this. My own feeling is that while Russian forces are engaged, the whole apparatus that he's built, surrounded by security chiefs and with deep layers of protection, mean that nobody is going to challenge his power in the short term. But if it turns out to be less than what he wanted, and that Russia bogs down in a long-term occupation with a continuing high level of casualties and body bags going home, then yes, then I think his position, is undermined. And I remember Khrushchev misplayed dramatically over the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. He didn't last very long afterwards. He was ousted afterwards. So I think it's not by any means a given that we're going to be looking at Putin staying in power for many years to come. And it's just possible that a future successor to Putin, although no doubt would again be a hardline Russian nationalist, wouldn't carry with him or her the baggage that Putin has from those early post-Cold War years, and that sense of burning humiliation, which seems to be what's driving him now.
And do you think there is any hope of a democratic change within Russia in the near future?
No, I honestly don't. I mean, I fear that Putin would be succeeded by another tough autocrat operating the same system corrupt, kleptocratic system that is running Russia now. But there is a younger generation in Russia who've been accustomed to consuming the good things out of the West, the iPhones and the holidays in Western Europe and the European and American culture, who are now going to be cut off from that. And over time, perhaps they will judge that the cost of this policy is much greater than any possible benefit to Russia.